Bruno Mars disguised as a homeless man exposes shocking police bias in New York. Watch the jaw-dropping encounter that's shaking the system. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and please complete our 1,000 subscribers for more inspiring stories. It was an ordinary afternoon in New York. The sun shining brightly, casting long shadows across the city streets. The sounds of traffic and distant conversations filled the air, but amidst the hustle and bustle, there was a strange, almost eerie silence around one particular street corner. A man dressed in ragged clothes sat on the street, but this man was not just another homeless person. This was Bruno Mars, and he was on a mission to expose the hidden biases that lay beneath the surface of society, to challenge the way people judge those who are less fortunate, and to see how the police would react to a situation that many would rather ignore. As Bruno sat there, pretending to be just another faceless figure begging for spare change, he watched the world go by. People passed him without a second glance, their eyes quickly darting away when they saw the state of his clothes, the dirt on his hands, and the weary look in his eyes. They crossed to the other side of the street, avoided making eye contact, and kept walking as though he didn't exist. But Bruno wasn't just sitting there for the sake of blending in. No, he was waiting for something more, something that would change everything. It didn't take long before the first police officer appeared. The officer, a tall man in his late 30s, was patrolling the area on foot. His eyes scanned the streets, but as soon as he saw Bruno sitting on the ground, his gaze hardened. The officer slowed his pace, taking in the scene before him. There was something about Bruno that seemed off, but the officer couldn't put his finger on it just yet. As the officer approached, Bruno kept his head down, trying to act as inconspicuous as possible. He had been practicing his role for days, perfecting the way a homeless person might sit. Slouched, weary, and invisible. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he needed to know what would happen next. The officer stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he watched Bruno. After a few tense moments, he finally spoke. "Hey," the officer called out, his voice stern. "What are you doing here?" Bruno looked up slowly, his face filled with exhaustion. "Just resting," he mumbled, trying to sound as natural as possible. The officer didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, his hand resting on his baton, studying Bruno with suspicion. It was clear that the officer was waiting for something, perhaps for Bruno to make a move or say something that would justify further questioning. But Bruno didn't flinch. He stayed still, watching the officer closely, knowing that this was the moment that would reveal whether the system had changed or whether the biases that so often plague society still remained. The officer's stare lingered for a few moments longer before he spoke again. "You need to move along," he said flatly, his tone more authoritative now, as if he'd already made up his mind about the situation. Bruno, still keeping his gaze lowered, nodded slowly, not wanting to escalate things just yet. He shifted slightly, as if he were about to get up, but his eyes never left the officer. The officer seemed satisfied for a moment, but then something unexpected happened. Another officer arrived on the scene, a younger man in his early 20s who seemed to be in training, eager to assert his authority. The younger officer took one look at Bruno and immediately began speaking to his partner in a lower voice. But Bruno could hear the words clearly enough. "We should call it in. He's just sitting there like he's waiting for trouble." The older officer didn't respond right away, but the words stung Bruno. He had seen this sort of judgment before, but never quite so openly. It was one thing to be ignored, another to be seen as an immediate threat without cause. It was the subtle form of racism that many didn't even recognize. Bruno had hoped for more, but now it was clear this wasn't about him being homeless. It was about how people viewed him because of the color of his skin. He couldn't let it go unnoticed. This was the moment that Bruno had been waiting for, and he had a choice. He could either back down and remain silent, or he could confront the injustice and challenge the officer's assumptions. Taking a deep breath, Bruno pushed himself to his feet slowly, trying to make it look as natural as possible. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His question was simple, but it was loaded with intent. The younger officer turned sharply toward him, his eyes narrowing, clearly caught off guard by the question. "You're causing a disturbance," the younger officer snapped. But Bruno could tell it was more out of instinct than reason. The officer didn't have a clear answer, just an accusation that had been thrown out too quickly. Bruno wasn't going to let it slide. "I'm not causing any disturbance," Bruno said, his voice rising slightly. He straightened his back, suddenly feeling the weight of the situation. "I'm just sitting here, minding my own business. Why are you treating me like this?" The older officer, who had been silent up until this point, stepped in. "Hey, calm down," he said, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. "There's no need to get confrontational." But Bruno wasn't backing down anymore. He stood his ground, facing both officers now. "This is exactly what happens every day to people like me," he said, his voice filled with a quiet but unmistakable anger. "You see someone sitting on the sidewalk and you assume they're up to no good. You don't know anything about me, but you're already making your judgments." The younger officer looked uncomfortable, his gaze darting between Bruno and his partner. The older officer seemed to reconsider his stance, but instead of acknowledging the truth in Bruno's words, he simply waved his hand dismissively. "Just move along, all right?" he said. "We don't have time for this." But Bruno wasn't done yet. He had come this far for a reason, to expose the biases that were deeply ingrained in the system. "Why do I have to move?" he asked, his voice steady but powerful. "Why is it that you see me and think I'm a problem?" There was a long pause as the two officers stood there, and for a moment it seemed like neither of them knew how to respond. Bruno was no longer just a homeless man in their eyes. He was someone who was challenging the way they saw the world. And that, it seemed, was something they weren't ready to face. The silence that followed Bruno's question was thick with tension. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Bruno could see it in their eyes. They were unprepared for this confrontation. In their minds, he was supposed to back down, retreat into the shadows like countless others before him. But Bruno wasn't going to make it easy for them. The younger officer, who had been noticeably uncomfortable from the start, shifted his weight from foot to foot. His gaze flickered to his partner, but the older officer was still silent, watching Bruno with an unreadable expression. "You should just go, man," the younger officer said finally, his voice lacking the same authority it had a moment ago. His discomfort was palpable now. It's just easier for everyone if you leave." Bruno took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. He was no longer just a homeless man in their eyes. He was a man with a voice, and that was something they clearly weren't prepared for. "Easier for who?" Bruno asked, his voice steady but filled with challenge. "Easier for you? Easier for the people who walk by and judge me without knowing anything about me?" The older officer sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead in frustration. He seemed to be caught between his duty and the growing awareness of how wrong this all felt. "Look, man, we're just doing our job," he said, his voice softer now, but still carrying that sense of superiority. "We've got rules to follow. People can't just sit on the sidewalk all day." Bruno shook his head slowly. "It's not about the rules, is it?" he asked, his tone more resigned now. "It's about who gets treated like a person and who doesn't." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to justify his actions. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The weight of Bruno's words hung in the air, suffocating the situation. For the first time, both officers seemed unsure of themselves. Bruno knew this was his moment, the turning point. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been unfairly judged, marginalized, or ignored. He wasn't going to let this slip away. "That's the problem with the system," Bruno continued, his voice now strong, unwavering. It's not about what we've done. It's about how people see us. You see a man sitting on the sidewalk and assume he's a criminal, assume he's trouble. But you know what? I've got just as much right to be here as anyone else. The older officer shifted his weight again, visibly uncomfortable. All right, he muttered, his hand waving dismissively. Just go, get out of here. But Bruno stood his ground. I'm not going anywhere until you acknowledge that what's happening here isn't right, he said firmly. You can't just dismiss me like that, like I don't matter. The young officer seemed to take a step back, his face contorting with the realization that Bruno wasn't going to play the role they had assumed for him. He looked to his partner for guidance, but the older officer's expression was unreadable. In that moment, Bruno felt a shift. It wasn't a big one, but it was enough. The younger officer had started to understand that this wasn't just about a man sitting on the street. It was about the larger picture. It was about the injustice, the inequality that people like Bruno faced every single day. Bruno's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just another day. This wasn't just another encounter. This was a moment of truth. The young officer took a deep breath and looked at Bruno, his eyes no longer filled with suspicion, but with something else, a glimmer of understanding. We're sorry, he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. We didn't mean to... Before he could finish his sentence, the older officer cut him off. Just move along, all right? He said, his voice hard again, dismissing both Bruno and the situation. But Bruno wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't interested in empty words. He had made his point, and that was enough. Without saying another word, Bruno turned and walked away, his back straight, his head held high. He knew that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. He had planted a seed of doubt in the mind of the younger officer, and that, in itself, was progress. As Bruno walked away, he could feel his heart still racing in his chest. The interaction had taken more out of him than he had expected, but as he glanced over his shoulder, he noticed the two officers still standing there, the younger one with a conflicted look on his face, the older one still stiff and rigid. Bruno couldn't help but feel a sense of victory, not for himself, but for the countless others who had been ignored or mistreated by a system that didn't care. He turned a corner, leaning against the brick wall of a nearby building to catch his breath. What had just happened? Was it enough? The question lingered in his mind, but deep down, Bruno knew he had accomplished something important. The message had been sent, but the world didn't stop there. The streets of New York were busy as ever, the chaos of everyday life continuing despite the moment of change he had just sparked. Bruno could feel the weight of the city on his shoulders, but he also felt a small flicker of hope. The younger officer's face had haunted him. Bruno could almost feel his confusion and struggle. He hadn't expected the encounter to go the way it had. He was supposed to be just another statistic, another nameless face on the streets. But instead, Bruno had forced him to see things differently. Later that evening, Bruno sat on the steps of a small cafe looking out at the busy street. The city seemed so alive, so full of stories. How many people walked by without a second thought, without understanding what others went through? How many were dismissed, like he had been, simply because of their circumstances? His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. Bruno hesitated for a moment before reading it. "Hey man, this is Officer Grant from earlier. I've been thinking about what you said. I just wanted to let you know it's not lost on me. You were right. I'm sorry about how we treated you. You've opened my eyes. I don't know if it changes anything, but I just wanted to say that." Bruno stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't expected this. Not from the officers, not after everything that had happened. He had spoken his truth, but to receive validation, that was unexpected. He smiled softly, tapping out a reply. "Thanks, I appreciate it." but the real work starts now." The message was brief, but it held so much weight. For the first time in a long while, Bruno felt a sense of validation that had been so absent from his life. It was small, but it was a start. Change didn't happen in one grand moment. It was built one conversation, one interaction, one realization at a time. Bruno put his phone down and stood up, feeling the cool evening air on his skin. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this: he was part of something bigger now. He had started a conversation, sparked a change, and now it was up to others to carry it forward. He was done waiting for the world to change on its own. Bruno Mars may have started as a man in disguise, but by the end of the day, he had revealed the truth, and that truth was more powerful than anything he could have imagined. As Bruno walked away into the bustling streets, his heart was lighter than before. He was no longer just a person in a costume. He was a catalyst for something greater, and that was the kind of change worth fighting for. Bruno's phone buzzed again as he walked down the street, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the night air. He pulled it out, the screen lighting up with another message from Officer Grant. This time, the message was more thoughtful, more reflective. "I've been talking to my colleagues about what happened earlier today. I'm going to be honest, I didn't know how to react at first, but seeing it through your eyes, it changed how I see things. I'm going to do better, I swear. We all need to do better." Bruno stopped walking, staring at the words. He had never expected any follow-up from the officer, let alone this kind of message. It felt surreal, almost too good to be true. He had made his point that day, but it was beginning to sink in. Change was happening, and it wasn't just limited to the streets. The ripple effect had started. He had heard many stories, had seen the struggles, but this experience had been different. He wasn't just a celebrity here to make a point. Bruno Mars had become a symbol of something larger, a force for justice, a voice for the voiceless. And now, it seemed, others were beginning to listen. As Bruno continued his walk through the streets of New York, he noticed the little things, the way people interacted with one another, the subtle exchanges of glances, the way a smile could turn into something more than just a casual gesture. He realized that the social experiment he had embarked on wasn't just about exposing biases, but about showing the potential for empathy, for understanding in a world that was often quick to judge. He reached a street corner, waiting for the light to change. In the distance, he saw a group of people talking animatedly outside a cafe, a few of them looking at their phones, probably sharing the same video of Bruno in disguise. He smiled to himself. It wasn't about fame. It was about making an impact, creating a dialogue that people couldn't ignore. As the light turned green, Bruno crossed the street, his thoughts still swirling. In his heart, he knew he hadn't finished his work. It wasn't enough to have a conversation once and expect the world to change overnight. But he had sparked something that could grow and spread if nurtured. Bruno's phone buzzed once more, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, the message was from someone he didn't expect. It was a woman named Sarah, a single mother living in the Bronx. She had sent him a heartfelt message, sharing her own struggles with homelessness, with being judged based on her appearance. Her message was long, but there was a simple, powerful sentence near the end that stuck with Bruno. "Your video gave me hope. I'm not invisible anymore. You made me feel seen." Bruno stopped walking, the weight of the message hitting him like a wave. He thought about all the people like Sarah who had been overlooked, ignored, or silenced for too long. This wasn't just a social experiment anymore. This was a movement, and it wasn't going to stop with him. He looked up at the skyline of New York City, the bright lights illuminating the night. Bruno felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He had come here with a purpose. And now, that purpose was becoming something much bigger than himself. As he sat on a bench near Times Square, taking in the energy of the city around him, Bruno realized that real change was messy. It was complicated, and it didn't always come with immediate results. But in the end, it was worth it. He had opened eyes, had made people stop and think, and that was enough. Bruno Mars had disguised himself as a homeless person to test the police. But what he had uncovered was something far greater: the power of human connection, the ability to change hearts and minds, and the undeniable truth that no matter how small the action, it could lead to something extraordinary. The streets of New York seemed to glow a little brighter that night, and for the first time in a long time, Bruno felt like he had made a real difference. Thank you for watching till the end video. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories.